Sometimes, when you come across a game that you really enjoy, you might be excited to learn that there's a sequel in development. I mean, if you enjoyed the first installment, then surely the next one will be even better. Well, sometimes it is, and other times, not so much. It turns out it's really difficult to produce a second or third game in a series while keeping what made the originals good, but at the same time, changing things for the better. So let's take a look at some of the issues that developers face when trying to create a gaming sequel, some examples of games that failed to recreate the magic of the original, and also the games that really nailed their second outing. Now, before we start, this is not an exact science, and just because I use one game as an example of good or bad, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad game, just what it's like in relation to its predecessors. There is no handbook for how to make a gaming sequel, however there are plenty of guidelines in other media like TV, film and books to be able to draw some parallels. The introduction to a sequel is one of the most difficult parts to get right, particularly when it comes to games. Usually, the story shouldn't just continue where the first game ended, as the narrative of the first game should largely be resolved by the time you complete it. Instead, you want a jumping off point that makes sense to the player and is consistent with the story that was told in the first game, but that sets up its own unique plot. The first level of a game should cover the basics of gameplay and introduce the key characters that will feature in the story so you can learn more about their motivations and personality. Another thing to consider in an introduction to a sequel is the power level of the player character going into the game, particularly in RPG games where you may have spent hours and hours gearing up and acquiring new skills in the original. The developers might not want the player to carry all this power over into the follow-up. In this case, they need to find a way to strip the player of the powers they acquired in the first game without it seeming arbitrary or nonsensical. I personally think no game has ever managed to do both of these things as well as God of War 2. The original God of War was a fantastic hack and slash game about the Spartan soldier Kratos who trades his life for the power to defeat his enemies. But this results in the loss of everything he holds dear. Kratos is then spurred on to take revenge against those responsible for his misery, and ultimately he ends up killing and replacing Ares as the God of War. This is a great place to end the first game, with Kratos having achieved his goal of revenge and begrudgingly accepting to become a god despite that not being his true motivation. So, where do you go from here when you want to bring the character back? God of War 2 is not set immediately after the first game, when Kratos has just defeated Ares and claimed godhood. Instead, it is set when he is firmly settled into the role and has established himself as a brutal and cruel god, still haunted by his past and increasingly hostile to the other gods. The first part of the game sees Kratos joining the Spartan army in attacking the city of Rhodes, going directly against the advice of other gods. And the player quickly learns that Kratos is incredibly powerful thanks to his godly power. The intro quickly takes a turn, however, as Kratos is suddenly drained of his power by a giant eagle that he believes to be Athena, and this power is used to animate the Colossus of Rhodes, which tries to kill Kratos. In order to defeat the Colossus, Kratos is aided by Zeus, but at the expense of weakening him further. Once the Colossus has been defeated, it is revealed that Zeus himself stole Kratos' power as he would not fall in line with the other gods and was becoming reckless. Zeus then kills Kratos and you start the first proper level of the game in the underworld trying to escape. This introduction does so well for a number of reasons. It establishes the plot. Seek revenge on Zeus for his betrayal. It lets you play a tutorial level but with the power fantasy of being the God of War. And it ties Kratos losing his powers directly to the plot, so it actually makes sense for you to be starting out weak and gaining power and weapons as you progress through the game. This is an introduction done well. I spent a great deal of time playing Metal Gear Solid 4 when it was released in the early days of the PlayStation 3's lifecycle. I've completed it probably 6 or 7 times by this point and used to play the multiplayer religiously. The story is typical Kojima fare, and the length of the cutscenes in this game was unbelievable. It was like watching 3 movies. The introduction to Metal Gear Solid 4 was not groundbreaking by any means in my opinion, but it at least got you familiar with the game's mechanics, and by the time you'd played the first level, you were up to speed on what the game is about and what Snake's motivations are. The same simply cannot be said for Metal Gear Solid Phantom Pain, a game which I personally enjoyed, but when looking at it as part of the Metal Gear Solid series, seriously falls short compared to its earlier entries. The start of Phantom Pain is not completely without its highlights. However, when you first play through it, you're probably going to question if it was all a fever dream or if you've just had a stroke. You will have no idea what is happening for the majority of the intro, and it doesn't do a great job of setting up the story or many of the characters. The level ends with an on-rails shooter sequence after seeing a flaming whale eat a helicopter. Yes, you did hear me correctly. And that is to say nothing of the gameplay, which mainly consists of you crawling around like you've lost a contact lens or have just seen your ex walk into the bar that you're in. The intro is an hour long, which I know is par for the course with Kojima games, but after your first playthrough, the entire prologue section of the game becomes a chore more than an engaging introduction. This is the antithesis of God of War 2's intro, which is still as fun the 5th time round as it was the first. Phantom Pain's core gameplay is fantastic, but the way the introduction is set up means you don't actually get to experience it for over an hour, which is just a shame. Having done some reading on the forums about it, it looks like the intro sequence actually put some people off from playing further, which sucks because the game is actually good and just not served at all by its opening hour. A sequel that simply expands on a story is probably going to get very old very quickly without something else, and a great story is usually only one part of what makes up a good game. But what if your game series doesn't have much story and is much more about the mechanics and gameplay than the characters? Well, in these cases, most people would expect a deepening and development of the mechanics and features already available. Again, you don't want a game just to be a copy and paste of the game before it. So let's take a look at the Goldilocks of sequel changes. One game that didn't make enough changes, one game that made too many, and one game that got it just right. Kicking off with Borderlands 3. The first two Borderlands games I really enjoyed, with expansive open worlds and massive potential for how your character is geared with the randomized weapon system. The games relied on weapons that you get having random modifiers, which would increase the replayability of the titles. The story was never anything to write home about, however, the characters made the story more interesting, especially Handsome Jack being the main antagonist of Borderlands 2. When Borderlands 2 was released back in 2012, the LOL XD random style of humour was still something that many people found amusing, and that's what the game latched onto, with characters like Claptrap being pretty much entirely based around this. If you didn't like this style of writing or humour, then the game was probably not for you. Flash forward to late 2019, and attitudes had significantly changed. Borderlands 3 attempted the same style of writing and irreverent comedy as the first two games, minus the original writers that made them so great. The developers failed to realise that many who loved the first two games would now have grown up a bit more and be in their late 20s or early 30s, and much of their original audience would have outgrown dated characters like Claptrap. Now, I will say that Borderlands 3's gameplay does feel a lot smoother, and the guns feel better, the shooting feels better, movement has been drastically improved. But in my eyes, not enough has changed from Borderlands 2 to Borderlands 3. And Borderlands 3 feels more like a next-gen update to Borderlands 2 rather than its own distinct game. Not to mention the fact that the writing and the characters in Borderlands 3 are by far the worst in the series, and some of the worst writing in all of gaming. Now, I know I've talked a lot about Overwatch 2 on my channel already, and usually in a negative light. Overwatch 2 made significant changes to the gameplay formula of the original. The game, known for its drawn-out 6v6 teamfight gameplay, decided to remove one tank player from each team. This turned the already precariously balanced game into a 5v5 format that required significant rebalances of many roles and heroes, and made the game hell for anyone who actually had the pressure of playing as a tank. This was a massive change that nobody asked for and nobody wanted. The game also went free to play, which flooded the player base with brand new players who had no idea what they were doing. And it also introduced the Battle Pass system, which was way more restrictive in what you could earn. Nobody wanted this either. Overwatch 2 introduced 3 new characters at launch. However, going forward, you would need to unlock new heroes in the Battle Pass, which of course could be sped up by paying for it. No one wanted this. A new game mode was added, which was absolutely hated and considered fundamentally unbalanced due to the way the escort system worked. You get the idea. To top it all off, the one addition that had many players actually excited, the PvE mode, had its development cancelled before the game even released, and now all that will be released in the PvE mode is single missions, which, BT dubs, you will have to pay for. Overwatch 2 takes everything that makes a good sequel and throws it out the window. A great example of making quality improvements to gameplay would be something like Portal 2. The original Portal was a great game when it released way back in 2007, and was widely considered one of the most original and unique releases of its era thanks to its physics-based platforming. It did have a story which featured one of the best antagonists of all time in GLaDOS, but the often humorous story served purely as a vehicle for the gameplay, which was so much fun. The main complaints about the original Portal were its length and the fact that there was no couch co-op or multiplayer modes. So guess what Valve did when they released Portal 2? They made it significantly longer, with multiple new mechanics like the bounce gels or white paint to allow you to create your own portalable surfaces. Whatever, I'm keeping it in. The story also features the return of GLaDOS, but also introduces the new characters of Wheatley and Cave Johnson, voiced incredibly well by Stephen Merchant and J. Jonah Jameson respectively. And of course, the biggest change made to Portal 2 was the co-op campaign, which was separate from the main story, and sees 2 test robots solving more complex puzzles with a portal gun each. Overall, the differences between Portal and Portal 2 aren't super extensive. The core gameplay and ideas are mostly the same. But the sequel introduced new features in gameplay and new characters, which made it a truly great expansion of the original. Of course, making changes to a sequel is a fine line to walk. Change nothing and you have a cash grab like FIFA games. Change too much and you will lose the audience that gave the original its popularity. Now, up until this point, I've been talking about things that game devs are directly responsible for and how they affect the success or failure of a new release. But the truth is, the biggest impact on a game's success or failure actually comes down to something that nobody can control. The hype and expectation that has been set for a sequel is often a major contributor to whether it succeeds, and sometimes that's not very fair. On the one hand, the success or popularity of a game series leads to excitement in the run-up to a new release, and when a new game is released, it is exactly this anticipation and hype that drives sales. Elden Ring, for example, saw the hype train being used to incredible effect. Being marketed as open-world Dark Souls was such an incredibly exciting idea that people could not wait for it to release. And luckily for From Software, Elden Ring delivered exactly what everyone hoped for, and much more. But what happens when a game is hyped up to such a degree that it would be virtually impossible for the game to meet these expectations? Well, in the case of a game like Cyberpunk 2077, you get a dumpster fire of a launch which permanently taints the game's reputation. People don't mind bugs and poor optimization in games that they aren't hugely invested in, but creating even a small sense of disappointment in people who've been waiting years for a release is a surefire way to kill a game. But today, we're talking about sequels. So let's take a look at one of the most anticipated games ever released. A game that I bought on the day of release, and nearly stopped playing after about an hour. The Last of Us is one of my favourite games ever. I love almost everything about it. The characters, the gameplay, and the world building. However, the main thing I enjoyed about The Last of Us is the story, and specifically the relationship between the 2 lead characters, Ellie and Joel. The 2 characters start the game unknown to each other and through the events of the game, come to form a close, pseudo-parental bond between them. They both develop as characters throughout the game, and by the end you're really rooting for the two of them to be able to find friends and hopefully start a new life together as a makeshift family. The dynamic between these two characters is hands down the best part of the first game. So when The Last of Us 2 was announced, I could not wait for it to come out. I wanted more Ellie and Joel journeying across America in search of a cure, meeting interesting characters along the way, and dealing with bandits and infected in heart-pounding set pieces. So you can imagine my irritation when I bought the game and played through the first level where, spoilers, Joel dies. I actually sat there staring blankly at the TV thinking it must be a fake out. Now Naughty Dog knew that I would hate this. It was the whole point of them doing it. It was their way of playing with my expectations for the game. They knew I would want more Ellie and Joel, just like in the first game, and that was the story that I wanted to see. So they intentionally made their story run completely opposite to this. However, in this case, they didn't just subvert my expectations for the game. They removed what I enjoyed most about the game. Ellie, on her own in The Last of Us 2, is just vengeful to the point of utter stupidity, ruining the crafty survivalist personality she has in the first game. And Abby is a random character that I just don't care about. Now, whether you think this twist works is up to you, and I'm not going to say that you're wrong if you enjoyed it. However, the double-edged sword of expectations meant that I was extremely excited for, and ended up hating, The Last of Us 2. It is not an objectively bad game, I know that, but in the context of the first game and what made it so good, it is an absolutely awful sequel. Expectations can also be used to a game's advantage, and it isn't all doom and gloom. If a game doesn't have a massive buzz around it, and people just expect it to suck, then it can actually seem a lot better than it is, if it just manages to defy these expectations. The Witcher 2 was, by all accounts, a great game. Aside from the incredible difficulty and the jankiness that would probably be expected of a 2011 RPG release from a tiny developer in Europe. The game continues the story of Geralt of Rivia, a Witcher who has been chemically and magically modified to be a superhuman monster hunter. The games are not just all hack and slash though. The Witcher games are as much about political intrigue and the characters you meet than the monsters that you fight along the way. The game was well received by players and critics alike, and the announcement of a third game in the series came as welcome news to those who played these rather obscure, at the time, RPG games. But no one could have predicted the absolute powerhouse of a game that would follow. The Witcher 3 defied pretty much every expectation that people could have had for it. The gameplay was overhauled to be more engaging, with the choice given to the player to fight how they wanted. You could fight with powerful signs that could be cast in combat to control enemies or set them ablaze, or maybe you would become a spinning dervish of death with your swords. Perhaps you would shoot your enemies or blow them up with the many tools at your disposal. Even players of the original two Witcher games could not have been prepared for the sheer number of options available to you. The game engine was built from the ground up to produce some of the best graphics ever seen in an RPG by this point. The game world was truly expansive and open, unlike the linear progression of the first two games. Many of the characters featured in the originals would be brought back and their stories fleshed out even more, giving satisfying conclusions to some of the more central characters. The main story of The Witcher 3 is very long, and I think incredible, giving you plenty to do and even more to see across the various continents you travel to. Even the in-universe collectible card game would be so loved it would go on to be released as a separate game at a later date. By the way, please CD Projekt Red, bring back the original Gwent. All of this without even mentioning the two expansions for the game, which I would consider to be the best of any game to date. Blood and Wine, in particular, is longer than the first two Witcher games on its own. I'm talking about The Witcher 3 as a great sequel precisely because it defied any expectations people could have had for it. Who would have thought that a studio of 100 people at the start of development would produce a game with over 200 Game of the Year awards? I didn't even play The Witcher 1 or 2, I only picked up the third game around 2017 with no idea what it would be like, and it blew me away even 2 years after its release. To this day, it is a game I will boot up and just roam around and fight monsters or do odd side quests. The introduction to the game is great and lets even new players to the series get caught up. The changes made deliver some much needed quality of life updates and expand on the existing systems, while still keeping the game faithful to the original. And it's no wonder that even people who've never heard of The Witcher before were absolutely blown away by The Witcher 3. To sum up how expectations can make or break a game, I'll briefly talk about the game which was the inspiration for this video in the first place. A game which I would rate a solid 8 out of 10, but a game that I would still consider disappointing, purely because it was a sequel to the best game I've ever played. This may be a controversial opinion, I'm not sure, but the most disappointing sequel to me was God of War Ragnarok. Firstly, God of War 2018 is my favourite game ever. I love the God of War series. Norse mythology is such a fantastic world and setting to put a story like this in. The new characters introduced are all amazing, and the world building that Santa Monica does throughout the game gives it an unbelievable sense of life. 2018 is not without its faults. The combat got a bit samey after a while, and some of the bosses are perhaps reused a bit too much, but to me these are basically the only complaints I have of it, which is insane. I would probably rate this game a 9 out of 10 if I had to give it a number score. So why was Ragnarok a disappointment to me? Well, perhaps the studio was given an impossible task. I had an idea of what I expected from the Ragnarok story being told, as I love Norse mythology and I know a lot of the stories within it. Santa Monica put their own twist on some of the tales and fates of characters, and that's fine in my eyes, but the direction that they went with them is just not what I wanted to see. The pacing really takes a dive in the Atreus sections, particularly on Jotunheim. The addition of one weapon, which was largely useless as I preferred the axe and chaos blades, was not great. To me it would have made sense to take away the other weapons so you were forced to use the spear for a while to get a grip for it. And ultimately I didn't love the ending. Where I feel a game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla really nailed the Norse Ragnarok story, God of War's ending felt a bit like a Marvel movie at the end, and that's something that I say as a big Marvel fan. Ultimately, God of War Ragnarok was not a bad game at all. I got the Platinum Trophy on it, I completed it multiple times, so it can't be that bad. But it just wasn't exactly what I wanted to see. But that's my problem, not the developers. And I think everybody needs to remember that your expectations for how you want a series to end or develop is different from someone else's. And there's no right opinions when it comes to this stuff, it's all subjective. Ultimately, all of the things mentioned in this video contribute to a very, very difficult task for developers. I think that's probably part of why we keep seeing a million remakes and remasters, because it's much easier to do a remake or a remaster than it is to create new characters or an interesting story, or to wrap up all the loose ends so that everybody's happy, on top of adding new gameplay features and graphics. So it's no wonder that a good gaming sequel is one of the hardest types of game to make, and maybe we should all try and show a bit more appreciation for a game that manages to tick most of these boxes. Well, that about does it for this video. Let me know if you disagree or agree with anything that I've said in the comments below. Please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this type of content. Thank you very much all, and I'll see you next time.